Welcome Internet to Psychologist's Casual Review, and today we're going to be reviewing a very short and very interesting article written by Donald Carveth titled Self-Punishment as Guilt Evasion, the Case of Harry Guntrip. So let me preface this by saying that Donald Carveth is a psychoanalyst and, dare I say, a fellow YouTuber, which produces very interesting content. And for having read some of his articles but seen a lot of his videos, this article is completely in line with his videos on Fairbairn, Guntrip and Winnicott. So there's no major surprise in this article, but it was still very interesting. And I wanted to talk about because I think he puts the focal point on something very important, and namely this tendency on the whole of psychoanalysis in 2007, and dare I say, still very present nowadays, of shifting from the question of guilt to the question of trauma. And even though those are not mutually exclusive, and he does say that you need to understand both, I think in one of his lectures he even says that there is in everyone both tragic man and guilty man, in a way, that man is both guilty and he's also taken into a tragedy, a point that he also explicits in this article. So what makes this article very interesting is that for Donald Carveth, Harry Guntrip and Fairbairn and Winnicott are kind of all guilty, in a way, of demoralizing psychoanalysis. What he means by demoralizing. So it's DDE-moralizing. So fundamentally for him, psychoanalysis was emptied or gutted from the question of internal conflict to mainly focus on interpersonal struggles and the effects of trauma. So he makes it very clear that you need to analyze both, but it's not what he sees happening in psychoanalysis. What he sees happening is that there is a focus mainly on trauma and a complete disinterest or lack of pursuit of the question of guilt, inner guilt, what one feels deep down. And fundamentally, he takes on words like, for example, the superego, which used to be one of the core elements of early psychoanalysis, like Freud, Abraham, and so on and so forth, or Klein even. They used to focus on the guilt, on the, how can I say, on the bad side, on the quote-unquote evil side of each individual, as good or as sympathetic as he might be or she might be. There is a kernel of hatred, and that's what was focused on that guilt, for that hate, and that envy, which was fundamental, which he explicits in this article very well. But we shifted from that to a more trauma that focused in and forms of therapy. And I think he talks here about psychoanalysis, but we could generalize to the whole of the therapeutic and psychotherapeutic world, that it's mainly trauma nowadays. It's no longer about inner subjectivity, which we lose, and he explains that very well in the article, that we lose a lot by solely focusing on trauma and the question of trauma. So for him, the problem with Harry Guntrip was that, and he's going to heavily rely on Guntrip's work when the last article Guntrip ever wrote, which was about his analysis with Fairbairn and Winnicott. So I've already made a review and I've already read it on this channel. So fundamentally, feel free to pause this video, go and see that, or go and read the article. It's even better. And then come back, because it's heavily implicit in the article that you have to read what Guntrip has written to fully get the understanding of what he's going to say. So for him, Guntrip is, and was not necessarily capable of going to the full extent of what psychoanalysis could offer. For him, Guntrip, and that's the point of view of Don Carveth, was stuck in a premise in which, instead of seeing his own hatred for his brother Percy and mother, he only saw the traumatic effect of Percy's death. If you don't know, Percy was Harry Guntrip's brother, and he died when Harry Guntrip was very young. And fundamentally, that traumatic event had enormous repercussions on Harry Guntrip. And Donald Carveth is not denying that, but he's saying that the problem is that Guntrip never tried to fundamentally understand that inner hatred for Percy, because he then talks about how it is a very current fantasy when there's a sibling that comes into the world, that the first children or the first child feels kind of a lot of hate because he has to share his parents or caregivers' attention with someone else, and that someone else is going to steal the spotlight. So there is a lot of anger, resentment, and even hatred sometimes for the brother or the sister in question. And that resentment is something that's clinically very true. In France, psychoanalysis, so I think it's Laplanche, called it férocité, which is like in the French love doing game words, a combination of frère, meaning brother, and férocité, meaning ferocity. So it's brotherhood ferocity, really, in a way. So it's a very well-known clinical evidence, and virtually a quasi a priori. So Donald Carveth is completely legitimate by saying that it's one of the main fantasies, and yet Harry Guntrip never talks about it. And that's something that's very interesting, as if you've read the article of Harry Guntrip, he does not mention it. So the point of view of Carveth is that he, in a way, did not want to go that route, because he, in a way, stayed fixated on his paranoid schizoid position of blaming his mother as a failure, as an absolute failure that was not able to give good things to him or to his brother, and thus he himself was unloved in a way, and Percy's death was the catalyst of trauma and of the mother's incompetence in a way. This being the point of view of Harry Guntrip, re-explained by Donald Carveth. So it's very interesting. And of course for Carveth, the fact that he was not able to do that meant that in a way he lost a lot of clinical material even with his own patients, as Carveth in a way presents Harry Guntrip in his article as fundamentally Jesus resurrecting the dead, where trying to reframe the whole personality through trauma, rather than trying to understand that there is inner guilt within himself and within others. So it's very interesting because he also nuances his point of view by saying that Guntrip was fully intellectually aware that there was this question of guilt, projection, and so on and so forth, but he didn't integrate it within his own analysis. And he says that one of the main problems was that neither Winnicott nor Fairbairn were really into aggression as like a theoretical understanding, that they dismissed that point of view and focused too much on, for example, Fairbairn, the endopsychic structure, and for Winnicott on his own versions of the false self, and so on and so forth. And he said that in a way, all three of them, like Guntrip, Winnicott, and Fairbairn, are in a way guilty of dismissing guilt and the effects of aggression on the mind, and the envy both for the good object and the bad object. Well, when I mean envy for the good object, it's obvious, but envy for the bad object, because the bad object can be bad, and the individual has to repress that badness within themselves. So very interesting. That's my point, by the way. He didn't explicitly say that in the article, but that's what I got from it. So very interestingly enough, that point of view has led Don Carveth to fundamentally explain that Guntrip, in a way, prevented himself from that analysis by leaving Fairbairn too early, before the analysis of his will for aggression. For reference, Guntrip explains in his article that he left Fairbairn when Fairbairn became ill, and Fairbairn said that he was like Percy, he was fragile, and therefore felt that Guntrip might be afraid of losing him. Well, for Carveth, that was a missed opportunity for Guntrip to be able to explicit his anger and hatred towards this reactualized Percy, and that Fairbairn and Guntrip, both of them, missed something. And for him, he also prevented Winnicott from getting close to that. And for Carveth, the only person that could actually analyze Guntrip was Guntrip himself. All the others were gonna fail, and he made it very explicit in this article. That's what he thinks, his theoretical construct. That in a way, Guntrip could only be self-determined by Guntrip, that he was not really able to truly open up, and he stayed in a paranoid schizoid position in a way all his life. And that because Guntrip also talks about his chronic fatigue and his illnesses that were always there when someone left him, namely someone that was like a brother to him, and he would always fall sick. For Don Carveth, this is a symptom of a form of deep guilt, that in a way he would become dead in order to respect the law of Talion, because of the unconscious fear that Percy might destroy him if he doesn't at least pretend to be dead. Very interesting theory, and it's a very interesting article that goes even beyond that by saying that what have we lost by not focusing on guilt, aggression, and hatred. And it ends with the fact that even though Freud and Klein, in a way, are not necessarily main staples nowadays, that they still took the question of aggression and guilt very at heart. And he said that it was funny to see that, in a way, those analysts were fundamentally, in a way, more Christian by saying that there is a question of guilt than later analysts that were sometimes even themselves religious or had religious studies like Fairbairn or Guntrip. So very, very interesting. On the whole, it's a very good article. It deconstructs, I think, very well the points that Don Carveth makes. And on the whole, like generally, I agree with his point that we need both to understand that there is trauma. And he's very explicit about this. There's no, how can I say, he doesn't dismiss trauma. He says that it's very important to focus on it, but to also keep guilt, as guilt is an inner experience that also has the potential to help the patient understand his inner processes and subjectivity, and be able to change his relationship with internal objects also, as with himself. And I really like this article, but I must do a little disclaimer. This is Don Carveth's hypothesis. Now, why I'm saying that is that I think there's a lot of interesting things about his analysis, and fundamentally a lot of truths about what he's trying to explicit. But it's a reconstruction, because without Guntrip, or without Fairbairn, or without Winnicott, and if we were to put in parentheses of course, the professional secrets that they would have to abide by, there's things that you can't really know. You can guess them, and it's okay. And he does say this his hypothesis, so he's not saying it's the truth. But you have to understand that this is a construct, and it's an interesting construct, but it still remains a construct. It's still uncertain in a very fundamental way. As if I were, for example, because when I read the article and thought about Percy, I saw Percy as a mirror image of Guntrip. Both of them were not even differentiated, that they were both one and the same. And my point of view is very debatable. I'm not saying it's true, but all that to say that for me, Percy was an extension of Guntrip. And they were not even separated mentally by Guntrip at that age. So see, it's very interesting because we all have our points of view. And I'm not saying that they're mutually exclusive, right? I do believe that there's a high chance that Harry Guntrip must have felt a lot of aggression for his little brother, just because clinically, virtually all children with siblings have that. So it's fair. It's fair game to go that way. But I'm also thinking that for Percy was for Guntrip a double, a mirror, and that him dying in a way, killed a part of Guntrip himself, like encapsulation of death within Guntrip. But of course, that's really my point of view. It's absolutely not what Don Carveth is on about, and Harry Guntrip does not explain it that way. It was just an example to show you that everyone can have constructs, and constructs are important and interesting. And Carveth hits the nail on the head for what he tries to demonstrate, meaning that we have kicked out the question of guilt. And I agree with him, we have to reintegrate guilt, as trauma is fundamental, of course, and important. And I clinically feel that trauma has to be dealt with first, and after we can go for the question of guilt, as the person might need to be reinforced within their ego to be able to then go forward and inwards towards the question of guilt. And with the support of the clinician. So very interesting article, and just a little bit of caveat on the idea of construction and mental constructions, but very, very good, and I would highly recommend you read the article. So if you have any questions or anything you want to discuss in the comments, please feel free to drop by and take the time to write them, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.